We now take a look at part two of Locke's theory of right. Now, Locke believed in a state of nature, as did Hobbes, and another difference between Locke and Hobbes' view is that for Hobbes, the state of nature is the state of war and vice versa. Locke, however, draws a distinction between the state of nature and the state of war. So for him, the state of war is a state of, conflict and destruction, and there are various ways this can be brought about. So one way to initiate the state of war, you can see this as kind of a declaration of war, is having a person by their word or action present what he calls a sedate, settled design upon another person's life. And that creates a state of war. And he probably includes like the sedate, settled design to distinguish between, say, cases where someone, makes this clear and they're, sort of mentally competent, and cases where not. And he thinks that once somebody initiates a state of war by, declaring by word or action, this exposes the person's life to the other's power to take it and any who join them. So he's looking at presenting here essentially a justification for taking action in war, provided it's properly declared. Now, there are other cases, of course, that can provide effectively the state of war and yield the right to destroy. So what gives this right of destruction? His reasoning is this. He claims, as philosophers often do, that the view is reasonable and just, and what is reasonable and just in this case is to have a right to destroy what threatens me with destruction. And underneath this, underlying it, is Locke's view that there is a fundamental law of nature, which we saw earlier, that man is to be preserved as much as possible. So how does this justify destruction in some cases? The way he sees it is, if you can't preserve the safety of everyone, then the safety of the innocent is to be preferred. So ideally, of course, no one would get hurt. But then, as Locke sees it, if we can't make that the case, then the safety of the innocent takes precedence. And if there's a state of war, then a person can destroy someone making war on them for the same reason. He draws an argument by analogy here, by the same reason that one may kill a wolf or a lion, because they're presenting this threat. And another reason is that what makes them like these beasts is that people who engage in this war are not under the common law of reason, but have no other rule but of force and violence. So they may be treated as beasts of prey that are sure to destroy him whenever he falls into their power. So his reasoning essentially is that if there's a illegitimate, unjust threat of destruction, one is allowed to, basically destroy them back. And the justification for this is, although Locke thinks that we should preserve people, that there's a preference in favor of the innocent. So if someone is the victim, they have the right to destroy those attempting to destroy them. So that starts up the state of war. What else for Locke would start up a state of war in a just way, to allow the justification of harming someone justly? The next thing he considers is attempts to enslave. Although Locke has sometimes been accused of being racist and being involved in the slave trade, and it's true that he did have legal connections to it, his view about slavery is quite clear, specifically that if someone attempts to enslave another, that is effectively a declaration of war. Why? Well, as Locke sees it, someone who would try to get me or anyone else into their power without consent would clearly use and even destroy them. So, and no one, as he sees it, would have a desire to have me or anyone else in their absolute power, except, of course, to compel by force what is against the right of freedom, to make a person into a slave. And he sees all this as wrong. And the only way to secure one's preservation is to have freedom from that sort of force, the force that would take away, a person's freedom and enslave them. And once again appeals, as philosophers often do, to reason. He says reason shows that one who would take away the freedom is an enemy to my preservation, which seems reasonable. And so anyone who attempts to enslave me, or anyone else, creates a state of war. Now, Locke thinks that this is a threat to, everything. If someone threatens to enslave someone, because if someone would take away the freedom of any, must be seen as intending to take all the rest, that they're a danger to all the freedoms. And this could also be read as a person who would enslave one person is a threat to the freedom of everyone. And someone in the context of the state of society, because he considers here the state of nature, but even when we're in a state of society, anyone who would take away the freedom of society's members must also be seen as intending to take away everything else, and so create a state of war. So Locke also considers situations that create the state of war in the state of nature. And again, for Locke, the state of nature is distinct from the state of war, and attempts to enslave someone because it's a threat against freedom. And one also must consider that someone who would take away the freedom would take away everything, and this creates a state of war in which the person who is the target has the right to defend themselves. Even in the state of society, someone who would do this would be seen also as a threat. So Locke regards slavery as morally unacceptable, both in the state of nature and in the state of society. So what else can start up the state of war? Well, Locke says thieves. He believes that it's lawful to kill a thief. Now, someone might say, well, what if the thief, has not hurt someone, nor has declared any intent on one's life? Sort of the thief who says, I don't want to hurt you. I just want your, money or whatever. So Locke thinks that even if someone says, they haven't harmed their target, nor declared any intent to harm them, aside from the robbery, the person who's engaged in the attempted thievery, by using force where they have no right, they provide a reason to think they might take everything else. That is to say, if someone, even if they say they have no intent to harm their target, you have no reason to believe them. Because if someone's willing to rob you, they might well be willing to kill you and harm you. So he thinks that because of this reasoning, someone who threatened to take my property might kill me. So he thinks this provides a right to kill the thief if one can, creates a state of war. And so the person who introduces this state of war by attempting to rob somebody exposes themselves to the hazard of being killed. Now, Locke doesn't think you have to kill a thief, but he believes that if someone attempts to rob you, and thus creating a threat against you, you would have the moral right to kill them if you can. Now, he further emphasizes how distinct the state of nature and the state of war are on his view. Again, for our good dead friend Thomas Hobbes, Hobbes takes state of nature to be the state of war is state of nature. But Locke thinks the state of nature is pretty good. It's a state of peace, goodwill, mutual assistance and preservation, and the state of war is a state of enmity, malice, violence, and mutual destruction. And so he sees the state of nature as not a bad thing. So in this state of nature, he thinks people would be living together according to reason, and what makes it a state of nature is that they don't have a common superior on earth with the authority to judge. It's not a case of, for Locke, a case of lawlessness, a situation without rights, a situation of chaos. So state of war for him is distinct from the state of nature, and it's brought about by force or declaration of force, and that would create the state of war. When there's a situation without the possibility to appeal to a superior for relief, so like in the case of society. Now, this for him leads to the notion of a right of self-defense. So one question, especially in the United States, because the United States were very big on self-defense and the use of force in that regard, people often don't think about what is a justification for this. People just tend to assume we have a right to self-defense. So Locke, of course, argues everything, So, what gives us the moral right for him for self-defense? Well, his reasoning is this. In the case of if he considers like another case, like with a thief who steals stuff like when without threatening the person, like they break into their their home or whatever and steal stuff. So in the state of civil society, Locke believes that in that scenario, that the person can't go out and, well, they could, but they shouldn't go out and seek vengeance to kill or harm the thief, take the law in their own hands, as they say, because in that case, the person, although they wronged them, the person wasn't a threat. They didn't present the direct threat because the target, the person, the victim, was not there. But as we saw earlier, if it's a scenario where the thief attempts to rob a person, in person, and in this scenario, Locke imagines in civil society, the law, which is created for our preservation, in this context, cannot secure one's life because, and as Locke notes, your life can't be restored, unlike property. And he believes this permits self-defense. And essentially what is happening kind of conceptually is, even in the case of civil society where there's law, police, judges, etc., it creates a scenario where if someone threatens you and you have no recourse to the police and law, etc., it's either unable or unwilling to protect you, then it brings you, according to Locke, into a state of nature, because in that context there's no superior authority present, and also into a state of war, because not only is there no superior authority able to act in that scenario, the person has made a threat against you and put you into a state of war. And so in that case, you're morally allowed, according to Locke, to engage in self-defense. So that's his model for the moral justification for self-defense. So Locke puts pretty strict limits on when we can hurt each other, and the primary justification is protecting ourselves and protecting others from wrongful actions. Locke also, as he noted, talked about the right of property. So we have, his look at the right of life, right of liberty, and now the right of property. Now, in our society, it's, property, money, etc. is a central thing. And we probably don't give much thought to the justification of property. We probably just simply assume we grew up with property is a thing, property is protected by law, property is really important, and it's all just kind of assumed to be mostly justified. There are, of course, those who do raise criticisms of notions of property, so it is reasonable to provide an account for property. Even though, again, we just kind of assume it's all justified or don't even think about the justification, it's a reasonable question. What gives people the right to own things, to claim, things like, like their laptop or their car, or, entire islands as their personal property, claiming oil, gold, etc. as their property? What justifies that? So people, of course, have tried to look for justifications for this, in order to provide a moral, account. So what's Locke's account? Well, Locke presents essentially the labor theory of property, which works like this. And it begins with religion, his view of God. So as he sees it, in the beginning, God creates the earth, and he gives earth and all the stuff on it to everybody. It's there for our support and comfort, and its fruits and beasts belong to all of us in common because they're the product of nature. So in the beginning, there's, according to Locke, God creates the world, everything on it. Then humans, we're created on his account. And so initially, no one owns anything because there's just, people and God's created everything. So how do we get from his view, like God creates the earth, gives it to everybody, to now everything is, all the land and gold and oil is all divided up, and people, claim ownership of all that stuff. And now you're born into a world where everything is owned by other people before you even arrive. So here's how his reasoning goes from that state of God creates the world, nothing belongs to anybody, or everything belongs to everybody. So he thinks that since the world and everything on it, according to him, was created for us, there must be a means to appropriate these things before they can be useful. For example, fruit or venison, which is deer meat, which in order for that to have any use to us to survive, a person has to like claim that apple or claim that deer before they can, before it can do them any good. And of course, if you take like a like a piece of like a grape or something, if you eat it, well, someone else doesn't get it. So you have to have a right to that, at least on Locke's view. So how do we go from the state of everybody owns everything to the division? So again, as Locke sees it, the earth and all inferior creatures, plants, animals, belong to everybody. And again, this doesn't answer the question what justifies dividing it up, but according to Locke, here's what does. So as we saw, Locke claims that God owns everybody, but apparently he's cool about it. So in effect, each of us, laying aside, that God owns us all, each of us owns ourself. So I own me, you own you, Donald Trump owns Donald Trump, Taylor Swift owns Taylor Swift. And according to Locke, no one else has a right to our person. So only me has right to me. From this, Locke infers that a person's labor and work belong to them because they own themselves, laying aside that God owns everybody. And so any work they do belongs to them. And what he comes up with is this theory of mixing labor. So you have something in the natural world, going back hypothetically to like the beginning, you have an apple tree. Someone has to go up to the apple tree. If they're hungry, they pull off the apple. They put some work into it, not a lot, but then they eat the apple. So the apple is theirs because they join to the apple that belonged to everybody, something of their own, some of their own work. Or like with something involving more work, imagine someone washes up on a desert island and they gather up coconuts, etc. Well, then they're theirs. They go and gather wood and chop down trees and thatching and make a hut, etc. Well, they've taken all this common stuff and made it into their own hut, their own, gathered the food. They might start growing crops, etc. And by mixing their labor with it, they take it out of the common and make it their own. And this does have some appeal. If everything belongs to everybody and a person puts their work into it, they've added, value to it and can claim it. Now, Locke does put on a proviso, which is this, that, because someone may raise the question, couldn't you just like go around and grab like everything or grab like the best stuff? Could you just like run around? Imagine, there's a shipwreck, you're on the desert island. Could you just go and like tap every coconut and every tree with a stick and say, this is all mine now? And Locke says there's a limit on what a person can claim, which is this. There's got to be enough left and is good for everyone else. It's kind of like the party rule, like a party with food. If you go to a party, and you saw someone like just taking all the food off the tables and like shoving into like a duffel bag and grabbing like they go over to the shrimp, take all the shrimp and grab all the best drinks and all that. Well, that would break the basic rule of parties, which is you leave enough for everybody and don't take all the best stuff. So that's kind of what Locke is envisioning, that I or you or anybody, we can take what we need, but we have to leave enough for others. Now, obviously, I guess spoiler, we obviously don't have that today because some people have lots and lots and lots, like literally owning entire islands, mansions, etc., planes and yachts. And other people have nothing. They might own their clothing, for example. So how did we get there? How do we get here from there? So Locke also does put some limits on it. So again, going back to that question of, can I just run around just grabbing up everything and just claim it all, on just by putting some labor into it? Now, Locke his argument here is a religious one. He bases the common property of the earth on a religious notion. God creates it, so that's why it belongs to all of us. But he also thinks that the Bible says that we can't just grab everything, because God is giving us all things richly, and he has given it to us to enjoy. And Locke interprets this as saying, you can take and I can take as much as we can use before it spoils. We can't just like grab everything up and take too much, and we can't just like grab up stuff and let it go bad. So if there was state of nature and there's an apple tree and I could like eat 3 apples a day, then I could take 3 apples a day. If I take, like all the apples up, pull them off the tree and go and hide them, and more than I could eat, and they all rot, a bunch of them rot, then on Locke's view, that would have been unjust. I would have taken more than my fair share. Because this is based on his religious view, that nothing was made by God for us to spoil or destroy. Although, to be a bit cynical, we do spoil and destroy quite a bit of stuff. So Locke is kind of thinking, to the beginning way of the earth, and he's right about this. We know historically that early on, lots of earth, lots of planet, and relatively few people. So he says, considering the plentiful resources and the few spenders and the limits of one person, what people could do, like way back in the way back, there would be little room for quarrels or contentions because there's just so much space. And, you could kind of imagine this like in a, think of like a video game scenario where there's only a few people playing, there's vast resources. And if you don't like what's going on in one area, just, go somewhere else. There's always a place to go. So again, that's the way Locke sees it then. But how did we get to where we are now, where a few people own, again, you get a person who literally owns like an island and mansions and a yacht and a jet plane, billions of dollars, and other people, starve to death. So how do we justify this given Locke's view? So what he does is this. Here's how we get unequal division of property. It's money. That's for Locke. He can be criticized for this because it does seem to run against what he says earlier. So at some point, again, for Locke, this doesn't have to be like historical, but we develop gold and silver, or more abstractly, develop money. And of course, gold and silver have little practical use relative to food, clothing, etc. And Locke notes that the value of gold and silver, or we could say in general, money, stocks, bonds, etc., their value, he was well aware the value is just from consent. We just agree to it. We essentially we're playing a game, and instead of like a monopoly money where monopoly money buys like monopoly property, we allow our fake real world money to buy real stuff. And so he claims that because of our agreement to accept effectively money, we have agreed somehow to disproportionate and unequal possession of the earth. How so? Well, you might think, I didn't agree to this, especially if you're a person who doesn't have like an island and a yacht and billions of dollars. You're probably thinking, I don't remember ever like agreeing to that. But Locke says we have done so by tacit and voluntary consent. What tacit means, essentially, you agree to it, not explicitly. It's just you agree to it typically just by being there or remaining. So, for example, if, like when you go someplace and they're like someone's house and they have, about their, the kind of behavior they expect. And the idea is that by remaining there, one gives tacit agreement to go along with it. You don't have to sign a contract with people that you'll, behave in a certain way. It's just tacit consent. Also, in terms of, supposedly by being born like in the United States and remaining, we don't have to actually sign forms saying we agree to this. We give our tacit consent. Or so he claims. So what he claims we've all agreed to, and obviously not everyone has agreed to this or agreed to it freely, is that what a person can do is they can receive gold and silver in exchange for the surplus. And you may wonder, like, well, why gold and silver? Well, again, we saw that Locke's rule is you can't get more than you can use, and you can't just let it spoil. And the obvious feature of gold and silver, if you happen to have some, look at if you happen to have like a gold ring or watch or something, check it for an expiration date. And obviously that's absurd. It doesn't. Gold and silver don't spoil or decay. And he claims that this could be hoarded without injury since they don't decay. So we, according to Locke, agreed to this unequal distribution of private property because we value gold and silver, and we tacitly agree to use money. In our agreement, again, it's not explicit. You certainly didn't go and sign a form saying, check, I accept money, get the use of money and unequal distribution. The idea is we just kind of go along with it. And so since gold and silver doesn't spoil, what a person could do, we could have, this is not Locke's example, but you can imagine kind of a hypothetical, scenario. Imagine, there's a shipwreck, people wash up on an island far away with no, in the past, no hope of rescue. So people gather, coconuts, etc. And then one of the people there says, "Hey, I'll buy your coconut tree." And the person says, "Oh, great!" Accepts the gold and silver. And then they realize, how do I get, how am I going to get coconuts? And the person says, "Oh, no problem. You go and you work, you gather coconuts. I will pay you some silver for them. Then you'll have the silver, and then of course you can buy the coconuts from me." And so what a person would do is they would obviously buy the coconuts from the person for, say, like a silver piece, just made up amount, and then sell it to other people for like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 silver pieces, thus making a profit. And as they get more silver, they can go and buy more trees, get more people to work for them. They'll have lots of people working for them, paying them each like a silver piece for a coconut, and selling the coconuts back to them for, say, like 5 silver pieces. And soon they'll own all the trees on the island, and they'll have a big pile of, of silver. And there'll be an unequal distribution. And according to Locke, everyone would just go along with that tacit agreement. So he thinks that once we have civil society, governments they regulate this. They regulate possession of land, the money and property, etc. So the gist of it is, we basically, once we have money doesn't spoil. People can use their money to hoard. They can hoard it and get a bunch of it, and then buy everything. And Locke seems to think that's all just fine because we all agree to this. And again, this kind of goes against his previous view, which is there must be enough left, and as good for everybody. Money seems to be the kind of, one trick that breaks the system is, the spoil or decay thing. And again, this is Locke's view, trying to justify our system of property. And a fair question to ask is, does it make sense? Does it actually work? Our last thing for Locke is looking at the question of tyranny, because we're talking about rights. So what about limits on the government? Once we have civil society, according to Locke, what limits must governments supposedly respect? Now here, Locke's concern is with tyranny. Now we tend to think of tyranny probably kind of dramatically, such as stormtroopers marching in the streets, kind of the Star Wars thing, or police oppressing the people, etc. Or like like a tyrant who's kind of an evil movie villain. Now Locke, of course, would consider all those extreme things to be tyranny, but he defines tyranny in a rather interesting way. So tyranny is not just these excessive things where you have, like, we think of it like an evil tyrant of movie villain kind of fame. It's defined as an exercise of power beyond right, which none has a right to do. And this is using power, according to him, not for the good of those under it, but for one's own private, separate advantage. So tyranny for him would be something Again, it wouldn't be like the extreme thing we think of as like, marching oppressive police or armies, crushing people under their boots. It would be something as simple as if you have someone in Congress, for example, using their ability and their knowledge and their influence to engage in some insider trading. They know that they're going to be passing a law soon, and that a company will be worth far less under these new regulations, so they sell it off and avoid a loss. Or they know that the new regulations will free up a company to make a lot of money, so they buy up a bunch of stock, and then the stock value increases the next day dramatically. And for Locke, we don't typically think of that as tyranny, but for Locke that would be, because the point of the power of the state is for the good of the people and not the advantage of the person in office. Given Locke's definition, most politicians today would be tyrants, even though we probably wouldn't think of them as tyrants in the usual sense. So for him, tyranny occurs when the governor, however small or however large, and however entitled, makes their will and not the law the rule. So they basically put themselves above the law or beyond the law. And again, critical for Locke is the point of government is not to enrich the people in government or push particular agendas. It's to preserve the life, liberty, and property of the people. And if a governor, however entitled, uses their commands and actions not for this, but for their own advancement, that would be, for Locke, tyranny. And so if they direct their actions and will towards satisfying their own ambition, their own revenge, their own covetousness, basically greed, or any other irregular passions. So if a politician was talking about, if reelected, they're going to get revenge on people, take out this vengeance, Locke would say, oh, there you go, that's a tyrant. Or if someone is using the resources of the state for their own ambition, say using the resources of a state to help, their political position, to get elected president by, passing various laws and doing various things with state resources, for Locke, that would be tyranny. Again, it wouldn't be the sort of tyranny you think of, of jackbooted thugs kicking down doors and evil, overlords on thrones. But for Locke, the tyranny would be this misuse of power, using it for one's own private advantage, revenge, etc. So for Locke, where law ends, tyranny begins, if the law is transgressed to another person's harm. So, essentially transgressing the laws on the part of person in the government, that would be tyranny. He believes that if a tyrant engages in tyrannical behavior, and again, his view of tyranny would be behaviors that are generally allowed and accepted and expected among politicians today, enriching themselves, using their offices, to advance their own interests, getting revenge on their political opponents, that type of stuff. And Locke thinks that that sort of behavior would justify opposing them, and because they're using their force to invade the rights of others, and so they can be opposed. And he believes this holds not just to the highest magistrates, but also, all the way down. Now, he notes here the idea of the, because one thing in the United States that's often featured in, legal dramas is that even if there's like a warrant for someone's arrest, that they can be arrested on the street, they still have to, the police generally have to still get another warrant to get into somebody's house, or in their property. And Locke notes this. This is kind of the basis of it, that if someone has the authority to seize someone in the street, if they try to get into someone's house without the proper warrant, then Locke believes that they could be resisted. Now, of course, as a practical matter, if one dares to resist the power of the state and the police, then one is likely to get shot and killed, and and the police are likely to suffer very little consequences from such behavior. Locke, notes this notion that there has to be the use of breaking into someone's house has to be properly justified. And again, he thinks it applies to the highest and the lowest, and that it's by drawing analogy, it's not right for the eldest person, because they have the most to take away their younger brother's stuff. It's not right for a rich person to have a right because they just have so much to seize the cottage and garden of their poor neighbor, and likewise for authorities. It is exceeding the bounds of authority is no more right than in the case of a great, officer like a high politician versus like a low politician. No more justifiable in a king than a constable. And you could say it's even worse for someone who has more power because they already have much more, and they're supposed from their education, employment, and counselors to know more of right than wrong. So it is actually worse for people at higher positions because they should know better. So Locke views tyranny as something that can be opposed. Now, this, of course, had a huge impact on American political philosophy, and not surprisingly, much of American political philosophy is drawn from John Locke, quite explicitly, including, of course, standing up to tyranny. During the American Revolution, that's how resisting England, United Kingdom was largely justified, that they were engaged in tyranny. So that takes us to the end of our good dead friend John Locke, looking at rights, property, life, liberty, etc., and opposing tyranny. And so next, we'll turn to looking at the question of obedience to authority. But for now, stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.